My name is Javier Evans, and I'm a solutions engineer on the Community and Alliances team here at NGINX. Today, I'm going to take you through some fun ways to script NGINX using NJS. You're going to spend the rest of your time at this conference expanding your mind with important and complex topics like OpenTelemetry and Kubernetes integration, but not here. Instead, I'm going to take you on a mental vacation where the only requirement is that you have a little fun with me and refrain from totally falling asleep during the presentation. But first, let's make sure that you know what NJS is. Put simply, it's a way for you to script NGINX using JavaScript that's designed to operate in a complementary way with NGINX. If you've heard of writing modules for NGINX using Lua, this is a similar tool, but uses a language that might be more familiar to you depending on your background. NJS is its own implementation of JavaScript in NGINX that's separate from Node.js and browser-based implementations. A caveat before we get started. Today, we're on a mission of fun, not rigor. We'll do some things in the following code examples that will help us create some weird functionality and learn some concepts. However, don't mistake them as being production ready. With that out of the way, let's get started. While other people dealt with the pandemic by baking or binging Netflix, I spent it in rainy Seattle writing precious, heartfelt poetry about the rain. It's too good not to share with the rest of the world, but I want to make sure that it is only experienced by those in the right situation to really feel it in their hearts. That is, I want to make sure that no one can read it if it's sunny outside. So how do we do this? Let's make a plan. First, I'm going to assume that the user is going to send me an HTTP request with the user location header specified telling me where they are. And I'm pretty sure they're not going to lie to me. Next, I'm going to make sure that I have an API key for this public weather API that I found, exported to the same environment that I'm going to use to run NGINX. And finally, I'm going to put those two things together to make a simple API request to this public weather API and figure out what the current weather conditions are in the requester's location, and tell people in sunny weather to go to the beach or something, and welcome those experiencing cloudy and rainy days into the comforting embrace of my beautiful poetry. So let's jump over the code and see if we can make this happen. I'm going to start off by showing you a very simple nginx.conf file, but I'll go through each piece to make sure that we're all on the same page. The load module directive up here brings in the NJS module and allows us to use the NJS directives in the rest of our configuration. The first NJS directive I'll introduce to you is the JS import directive. The JS import directive simply allows us to reference a file containing JavaScript code and optionally provide an alias by which we can use to reference it in the rest of the configuration. For example, I'm pulling in the precious poetry.mjs file, assigning it the alias poetry, and I'm using it down here to serve my poetry, which brings us to our next NJS directive, JS content. JS content is also pretty simple. It just changes the content handler for this particular location to the NJS script. In this case, we'll invoke a function called precious weather poetry on the poetry file. Now, we'll go into this in more detail later, but just know that it gives us the ability to serve our poetry. So let's load up this configuration and see what it looks like. So we'll load it up and we'll make a quick request to see these poems. There's the poetry. It's still really good and it still touches my heart. But we really want to make sure that someone who's on the beach or something like that doesn't get access to this because it's not really going to hit the same and they probably don't deserve it. So I'm going to put this behind a wall. And to do that, I'm going to pull in an NGINX module called HTTP auth request. Now, HTTP auth request is not a NJS related module. It's just a normal NGINX module, and it gives us access to the auth request directive. The auth request directive takes a path, and it's going to make a sub request to that path. And if it gets a 200 response back, it'll let the request through. If it gets a 401 or a 403 back, it's going to deny access to that location and pass that 401 or 403 back to the requester. So let's go ahead and make sure that we create that location for the auth request to hit. So I've just added another location directive. I call it auth. You can notice that these two directly match up. So the request from auth request will go down here. I've then added the internal directive, which just makes sure that it's only accessible via sub request within NGINX. Any external requests will just get a 404. Next, I've added another core NGINX directive called resolver and set it equal to the Cloudflare DNS. And this will just help us resolve the domain name for this public API that I'm using. And this is a good example of where NJS and NGINX have a complementary relationship. In NJS, I need to know what the resolver is going to be to make this external request. Instead of specifying it in NJS, NJS will know that resolver is the Cloudflare DNS because I've already specified it via a core directive in the nginx.conf. Now, next I'm using the the JS content directive to hook our main authorization script. So the authorization script is up here. It's from weatherauth.njs. I've aliased it as weather auth, and I'm calling a function called doAuth on it. So let's jump over to that file and see what it looks like. It's pretty simple. I've got the doAuth function defined, and I am exporting an object as default from the script with a key called doAuth and setting it equal to that function. In the future, I'm going to use this notation because it's a little bit shorter, but it means the same thing. So let's add some code to test out whether the auth request function is working like we expect. I'm going to use the R parameter, which is passed in by the NJS invocation, which is the NJS request object, which gives us access to some helper methods and some information about the request. For this, I'm going to use the return method provided by that object to just return 200 from this NJS script. So if we remember how auth request works, that should let our request through. So let's jump back to the terminal and reload our script and make that request again. There's the poetry, still good, still beautiful. I'm really happy with the poetry, but let's see if we can bar someone from looking at it. So we'll go back to that script and change that 200 to a 401 in the NJS. Again, we'll reload everything and we'll try to make that same request. But I'll take out the parsing because I know it's going to 401 me. There we go. So that kicked us back. So we know that the NJS script is getting hooked appropriately to deny access to the beautiful, precious poetry. Now let's get into the meat of the actual weather-based authorization that we're going to write. Now, if you remember, I'm going to take in the user's location and I need that API key. So I'm going to use the headers in object that's provided to me by the NJS request object to pull the header that the user provided out of the request and set it equal to location. Likewise, I'm going to look in the process.env object to pull out the value of the environment variable, weather API key, that provides me access to the weather API. Next, I'm going to add some kind of long but mostly boilerplate code to perform the HTTP request. Here, I'm just doing some housekeeping where the header comes in with spaces and potentially commas. So I'm just escaping that string so that I can include it in a query string. So it's going to be included right here. And I need to make sure that those spaces and commas are percent encoded. Next, I'm just going to interpolate the API key and that encoded location into a URI. Use the ngx.fetch function. NGINX is a global object provided by NJS to perform the HTTP request. Do some simple error handling, and then pull out the JSON that we get back from the request if it was successful. Next, I'm going to jump into what the JSON response from that weather API looks like. So here's a sample. It's got a key called current, which has a key called condition, and then a human readable text key. So partly cloudy is 1003, and that code is the code for representing the weather condition. Now I've kind of made that that constant up here so that the code is a little bit more readable. But basically how this works is 1000 is sunny, and as the numbers get bigger, the weather gets worse. So let's put us in a really nice position to do some very simple and naive logic here. So I'm going to pull that condition code out of the response, and then we'll just do some simple logic to deny access if the weather's too good. So we'll say if the condition code where the user is coming from is at least partly cloudy, we're going to go ahead and return that 200. And if it is not partly cloudy, we're going to return them a 401 and deny them access. And maybe they should start a pickup game of basketball or something. So let's go ahead and reload the code with that all in place. And I happen to know that it is sunny today in Seattle. So I'm going to make a request saying that I'm from Seattle. So user location is Seattle. And we'll see that we get kicked back because people in Seattle should be at the beach, should be maybe ordering a pretzel from a street vendor or something like that. And I also happen to know that in Seoul, Korea, it is raining. So the people of Seoul, Korea can see my poetry. They can feel the energy of the rain wash over them and probably benefit in a myriad of other ways that I'm not thinking of. Let's take a look at one more poem so that we really appreciate what we're providing to them. All right, with that out of the way, I think we've done it. We've successfully barred people from seeing poetry that they shouldn't be able to see. For our second story, let me tell you about the only time I was ever invited to a party. There, I met an investor type who really wanted to make an app that helped parents find quick on-demand childcare. Now, I didn't really want to build that, but I did want to get in on the idea and the money that came with it. I thought about an old application I wrote back in 2005 that is still up and running somewhere in the cloud that helped you find homes to board your dog, kind of like rover.com. Now, I don't really remember how it works, and I doubt I could even redeploy it, but I think I could use some NJS magic to trick this person into thinking I've gotten a working childcare app. So just like before, let's make a plan. I'm going to proxy queries coming into my new quote-unquote childcare app and pass them back to my old server. Next, I'm going to use advanced algorithms to remove red flag phrases like dog and replace them with believable phrases that make people believe that this is an actual childcare app. Then I'm going to basically sort of bathe every day in all the money I'm going to be making from this endeavor. So let's go ahead and jump over the code and see if we can make this work. Once again, I'm going to start off by showing you a simple NGINX.conf file. Over here, you're going to see some boilerplate that I've written just to sort of mimic the existence of this app that I'm proxying to. We don't have to worry about that too much. But here we'll see a familiar JS import directive, and we're taking the dogs2children.mjs file, which contains JavaScript code, and aliasing it as dogs2children for usage in the configuration. So going with our plan, let's first include a location that proxies queries to this server to the old one that I set up that's about a doggy daycare, and load it up so we can see what the requests look like. So we'll apply that configuration, and let's make a quick query to it to see what the listing looks like. So there's a listing. Pretty simple, dog haven near a great park. Ever wanted to find a place to your dog? This is really good, but I think it'll tip people off if they're trying to find a place to send their child for the day. So let's fix that so we can get in on the investment money here. For that, I'm going to introduce the next NJS directive, which is called JS body filter. And JS body filter does kind of what it says. It takes the response from the upstream and allows you to apply an NJS function to filter the body before it goes back to the client. In this case, we're using that main logic file that we've aliased as dogs2children and calling a function on it called translate. So let's jump over to the NJS code and see what that looks like. Once again, we've got kind of a basic skeleton here. The translate function exists, and it's exported by default as a key in the object. Now, we're pulling in that NJS request object like we did before, but the JS body filter invocation provides us with two more pieces of information. First is the chunk, which is just the chunk of the response from the upstream, and an object called flags, which gives us some information about the chunk, namely whether the chunk is the last one. We're not going to worry about these too much. We're just going to modify the chunk, and that's how we're going to accomplish our goal. But we're using a function called sendBuffer on the NJS request object and just passing it the chunk and the flags, and it'll take care of passing it back to the client. Now, this code in totality just passes the request through. So we should expect to see the same result for the request that we just did. But let's go ahead and make sure that that's the case before we move on. So I'm going to jump back and do this request again. And we can see that the request is exactly the same, but this time it's going to the body filter. So our next job is going to be to actually change it. So in order to do that, I'm going to include some replacements that I've thought of to help make sure that we don't get discovered. So these replacements, this is just basic JavaScript, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it. But the keys of this object are regular expression compatible strings, which take things that might tip off our investor that this is not a childcare app, and replaces them with phrases that are going to be very convincing to anyone who's seeing the actual content from the page. So now that I've got my replacements defined, I'm going to rewrite the translate function to apply them to that chunk and pass them back through. Again, this is a lot of code all at once, and we don't need to go into it very much because it's just JavaScript, but just know that we're taking that chunk and we're taking those replacements that we've defined up here, and we're rolling through them and applying each replacement one by one to the chunk until we've built up a chunk of the response that has all the replacements applied. Then we're saving it as new body, and we're passing it into send buffer, just like we did with the chunk before, for inclusion back to the client. With that out of the way, let's reload and see if our replacements have been applied. So we'll reload our configuration, and then I'm going to make yet another request. So here's the response. You can see that our replacements have been applied. And if I were looking for a place to send my child for the day, I think I could pretty much trust this and not have any issues. But we do have one issue here. You can see that this curly brace on this side doesn't have a friend on the other side. This isn't valid JSON. Something's been cut off. And what's happened here is that the content length header that was sent back from the upstream was shorter than the actual response. And that happened because we're replacing words like dogs with really believable but longer phrases like human children. So we've actually made the body of the response a lot longer. In order to deal with this, we'll use another NJS directive. It's kind of like the friend of the JS body filter called JS header filter, and it does what you might expect. It takes an NJS function, in this case we've called it remove content length header, and it uses it to filter the headers that are sent back to the client. So let's go ahead and go back to the JavaScript and implement that function so that we can get rid of that content length header. Getting rid of the content length header will force NGINX to go into chunked transfer encoding, and it'll go ahead and make sure that the response is received fully by the client. So here we've implemented the function. We get our normal NJS request object, and we're using the headers out object that it provides and simply deleting a key out of it. This is how we change headers that are coming out of the request. So we can set it equal to something else, delete it, add a new one, but it's just a modification of this object. Next, we're taking the function and adding it to our object that we export from this file, allowing us to reference it via dot notation like we are here. So that should take care of our little problem with content length. So let's reload the configuration one more time and make sure that this works. So we'll go ahead and make that same query, and we'll see that it's parsing properly. So this is valid JSON, and we've solved the issue. Let's take a look at one more listing just to make sure that everything is going fine. There's another listing, leave your human child, enjoy a weekend away. This seems like it'll pass muster. So I think we've done it. We've successfully pulled the wool over the eyes of our investor, and I think financial success is in our future. The final example doesn't have a fun story. I just thought it was interesting. We're going to use NJS to make NGINX generate QR codes for us. Just like before, we're going to make a plan. And I'm sorry I don't have good alliteration for this slide. First, what we're going to do is we're going to install a package from NPM called QR code SVG. Next, we're just going to use the package as it's described in its documentation. And last, this is kind of the new thing, we're going to transpile the code. NJS was written to be compatible with the ECMAScript standard, and it's implemented some of the newer JavaScript features that have been created since, but its support for some of the newer ones isn't super complete. So we're going to use transpilation to change some of the code that might exist in this NPM module into code that is definitely going to be compatible with NJS. We'll get more into transpilation later, but just know that it's going to be part of the plan. And with that all done, I'll have the ability to encode really amazing jokes into QR codes and send them to my friends and print them out and fax them to people, and it'll be great. So let's move into the next example. Just like all of our previous examples, I'm going to start by showing you a simple nginx.com file. This one's probably the simplest yet. And we're going to use a NJS directive that's already familiar to us to make this work, the JS content directive. Just like before, we're using JS import to pull in a file, assign it an alias, and then we're going to call a function on it to handle the request to this location. So the NGINX configuration for this example is very simple. Everything's going to be in the JavaScript. So let's jump over to the JavaScript. The JavaScript, I've already included a lot of it here because it's not super important. We're pulling in the library itself. I've created some constants to sort of change how I want the appearance of the QR code to be. And I've provided a blank function, which takes in the NJS request object and exported it as a key in our default object here for NGINX to use. So let's re-implement this generate QR code function to actually generate a QR code. And I know this is a lot of code again, but just know that it is using the QR code library as described in the documentation of the QR code library. So we're doing new QR code, we're passing in a bunch of options. The thing to pay attention to here is that the content is equal to testing. And then we're calling .svg in it to generate an SVG representation of the QR code. Finally, we're using the headers out object that we used last time to delete our content length to add the content type header to something that's going to be what the browser expects when receiving an SVG file. And finally, we're returning the code that we've generated, which is the SVG markup, back to the client with a 200 response. This time, instead of using curl, we're going to use the browser to test our change because that's going to be a little bit more interesting with the SVG QR codes that we're generating. So let's go over to the browser and see if this works. So here I've generated a beautiful NGINX themed QR code. If you remember from the code example, we set the content to testing. So if you were to scan this, you get testing back. But that's no fun. I want to put my own content in the QR code and have it be different every time. So let's make it so that we can supply a a query string parameter called content. And in that, just put whatever content we want and have it communicated via the QR code. So let's jump back into the code and see if we can make that happen. Okay, so in order to make that happen, we just need to add some parameter parsing to the generate QR code function that we've already created. I'm just going to pull that in and we'll go over it a little bit step by step. The part that's interesting is just this part up here at the top. So in order to access the query string arguments, we're going to use the NJS request object and call the .args object on it. From there, we can just access any named query string parameter to get the contents of that parameter. Now, the browser has added encoding to the query string value. So in order to deal with this, we're just going to use the query string module to unescape it so that it's nicer to read when we scan the QR code. In later versions of NJS, I believe that this will be unnecessary, but for now, we'll do this just to make sure that everything's readable. So we've got the content de-encoded and saved in the content variable. And the only thing that changed down here is we're adding it here instead of the word testing. Everything else remains the same. So let's save this, go back and perform our translation again, reload that server, and go back and see if we can apply the amazing joke that I've prepared for you all. So if I go ahead and make that request, you can see things got a lot more complicated here. If you scan it, you'll get a joke that I think will stay with you for years. And we did it. Now, I have something to admit to you all. I gathered you all here under false pretenses. All of those very true stories that I told you and the beautiful functionality that we created together were all designed to communicate something about scripting NGINX with NJS. First, is that sometimes it's easier to teach yourself a new thing by building something fun first. If you're trying to get started with NJS while at the same time think through a complex authorization problem, for example, you may not be able to give your full attention to either the tool or the problem. Not having the project be high pressure, I found, also increases the chances that we finish it. Just like simple arithmetic or vocabulary in a foreign language, a simple example can help you gain fluency in your tool, which frees up your brain to create better solutions. Next, if you're watching this, you're most likely already running NGINX in one or more parts of your infrastructure. If you're using the official Docker images, you've already got access to NJS. For other installations, it can easily be added as a dynamic module. The ubiquity of NGINX, as well as a general familiarity with JavaScript that you'll find on most teams, means that you'll have a low barrier to entry to add simple scripts where appropriate that can interact with NGINX natively. Although we built a lot of joke examples, they do illustrate the tooling that you have to modify data going into and coming out of your applications, as well as using NGINX itself as a web server. This gives you flexibility in dealing with old applications or maybe those that you don't maintain, as well as providing more remediation options to you during an emergency. And finally, having a JavaScript engine inside NGINX gives you access to the whole NPM ecosystem. I don't know how long it would take me to write a JavaScript-based QR code generator, but it would certainly be longer than the 5 minutes it took for me to set up that example for the first time. Be aware that in many cases, transpilation will be necessary, and it comes with performance and maintainability trade-offs, so keep that in mind. And that's all I have for you. Thanks for coming to my talk. I went a little overboard with the QR codes since I can now make them so easily. Check out the repo for more fleshed out code examples and explanations. You'll see that on the left. The code on the right contains my favorite joke, which is probably better than any other joke I've made in this presentation, and probably one that you can take with you for many years to come and maybe share with your children. Never stop having fun. Thank you.